Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. It's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers and our audience from all over the world with us for this very important conversation about transitioning to a low-carbon energy future in the Middle East. We come to you today from Amman, Jordan, from Dubai, from Bahrain, from New York, and from Washington, D.C. And I know that we are connecting with people all the way from Brazil to India, China, and all over the Middle East. This event is hosted by the Columbia Global Centers in Amman and the Center on Global Energy Policy at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University. We originally planned to host this event in person in Amman in late March, but we all know what happened in March, and as they say, the rest is history. We had to postpone it, but today we're able to reach a much larger and more global audience by virtue of the technology, the Zoom technology that we are using. The event comes at a very crucial moment for the global energy sector. Even before COVID-19, the world had undergone, and the sector in particular, tectonic shifts, rising tensions between Iran and the Gulf Cooperation Council states, attacks on Saudi Arabia, on Saudi and Emirati oil infrastructures, seizure of oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Mediterranean. We have also seen renewable energy rapidly becoming more widespread, despite President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. 24 US states have independently agreed to abide by the agreement. Countries around the world have pledged to become carbon neutral by the year 2050. The UK recently announced it has gone more than 2 months straight without using coal as an energy source. And of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, with lockdowns, disruptions on a global scale to supply chains, to energy usage and to air travel, there has been, of course, a number of impacts on the oil industry, which we will discuss today. More on a global economic front, the IMF predicts the global GDP will contract by 4.9% this year. And this is, of course, in many ways related to what has been happening in the oil industry, where a price war launched by major oil producers, namely Saudi Arabia and Russia, in an effort to take on the US shale industry, resulted in oil prices plunging below zero in mid-April in the United States, and an agreement, of course, that was reached subsequently to cut production by nearly 10 million barrels per day, but Brent crude is still down compared to pre-pandemic levels. The impact of all of this, of course, will be felt around the world, but I think particularly hard-hit areas will be low-income developing countries. The rentier states of the Middle East, both the rich oil-producing states who will feel the pain of the crisis over the long term, as well as the non-oil-producing states, many of whom depend on oil producers for labor, remittances, and aid, will be impacted. For the Middle East, already in the midst of crisis before the pandemic, shifts in the global energy economy, chief among them a shift towards greater reliance on renewable energy, are inextricably intertwined with regional economic and political trends. So with that as a mouthful, and to help us understand what all of this means, we have a truly brilliant group of experts with us. Jason Boldov is Professor of Professional Practice and Founding Director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. He joined the Columbia faculty after having served as Special Assistant to the President Obama that is, and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change at the National Security Council. Prior to that, Jason held senior policy positions on the White House's National Economic Council and the Council on Environmental Quality. Jason, it's great to see you. Robin Mills is CEO of Qamar Energy and he is also a non-resident fellow at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. Robin established Qamar Energy in 2015, a Dubai-based firm that specializes in energy strategy and commercial and economic consulting across the energy spectrum. Prior to this, Robin held major consulting assignments for the EU in Iraq and for a variety of international oil companies. And he has worked for a decade at Shell, concentrating on new business development in the UAE, Qatar, Iraq, and Iran. Thank you, Robin, for being here. I'm really delighted to welcome Leila Benally, Chief Economist and Head of Strategy, Energy, Economics, and Sustainability at Arab Petroleum Investments Corporation, or APICORP. Leila joined APICORP from Saudi Aramco, where she had been in charge of the company's energy policy and gas strategy. Previously, Leila was director for the Middle East and Africa at IHS, a global research and consultancy in security and energy. Nice to have you, Leila. And last but not least is Jonathan Elkind, who will be our moderator for today's discussion. Jonathan joined the Center on Global Energy Policy in March of 2017 after a career devoted to energy and environmental policy in the private and public sectors. From 2009 to 2017, John worked on international energy and climate issues at the US Department of Energy, culminating his time there as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. In earlier government service, John worked on the staff of the National Security Council, the National Security Affairs team of the Vice President of the United States, the Department of Energy, and the Council on Environmental Quality. Thank you, John. Before I turn it over to John as moderator, I invite our audience members to ask questions of our panelists by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will dedicate some time toward the end of this webinar to addressing questions from the audience. So with that, I turn it over to you, John. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Safwan. Welcome, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and particularly it's a pleasure to be with both Safwan and his team and the outstanding speakers that we have. Our topic, as has already been noted, is the transition to a low-carbon energy future in the Middle East. Before the arrival of the coronavirus, I used to refer to climate change as the problem of our age. Now I guess we have to think about it as the problem of our age if ever we can get back to focusing on it. One of the challenges that we face in this program today is the heterogeneity of the countries that we are going to be focusing on. To state the obvious, they're diverse in terms of economic structures, natural resource endowments, languages, cultures, and more. Some are world-leading exporters of conventional fuels and have economies and societies dependent on those industries. Others of the countries we're focusing on today are energy importers seeking to develop distributed energy resources such as solar and wind. We'll try to keep this diversity in mind as we go through the program. A couple of organizational notes and then we'll get underway. The first is that this is an on-the-record program. It is being webcast live and it is also being recorded. A full video recording will be available online through both the Columbia Global Center in Amman, whose website is globalcenters.columbia.edu/Amman, and also through the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy, which is energypolicy, as one word, .columbia.edu. For those of you joining us through Zoom, as Safwan just noted, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Those of you who are watching the live stream on Facebook can also submit questions there. And as an additional final option, you may submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CGEPLive and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. So having dispensed with those organizational questions, let's go to our program. Jason Boldov, the floor is yours to kick us off. Over to you.
Great. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for joining for this discussion, and thanks to Safwan and my colleagues at the Columbia Global Centers in Amman for organizing this activity. It's a region of the world I used to travel to often and enjoy going to, and I'm sorry we can't do this in person, but hopefully we'll be able to do that before too long. I want to thank John for helping to organize this, and Robin, who's a great colleague of ours in the region, and my friend Leila for being here as well. The Center on Global Energy Policy, just for those who don't know, is a research institute within Columbia University that aims to bring the insights from the academic work that the university does to an audience of practitioners, policymakers, people in the private sector who are deploying capital and help inform good decision-making about our energy future with a very strong global perspective, and that's why it's so valuable to have the global centers to work with within Columbia. So obviously the Middle East is key to understanding the global energy outlook, both the what might be called traditional energy outlook of oil and gas, producing about 1/3 of the world's oil, about 1/5 of the world's gas, but also I think importantly to the kind of clean energy technologies that we will need to see in order to address the challenge of climate change and achieve something close to deep decarbonization, which we must. The pandemic crisis of the past few months, I think, has given us a quick mini snapshot of what a future may look like and put into stark relief why the Middle East is so important to the energy system, but also the significant challenges that it may face moving forward. And of course, we are not going to transition as quickly as a collapse of 25% roughly of world oil demand in a month, but it's like one of those movies where you see the future, you travel to the future and see what things are like, and then that gives you a little bit of insight into helping to think about how you're currently undertaking your activities and to what extent you may want to continue with business as usual and to what extent you may want to think about adjusting over a long period of time to prepare for a different future. This 25% drop in oil demand in the month of April caused steep pain, of course, in many Middle Eastern states, forcing sharp fiscal contractions. I think the estimates I saw with oil prices of around 30 were that the 6 Gulf states, key producers, would face a fiscal shortfall of about $140 billion at those oil prices. So it's a bit higher now, a little over 40, but still somewhere over $100 billion in terms of the fiscal shortfall. Of course, this is likely to be temporary. Some Gulf states are better prepared than others to weather that storm through some combination of accessing their fiscal reserves and accessing or foreign exchange reserves and access to international borrowing. But that's not true for all Middle Eastern players, to be sure. This is also temporary because we have already seen oil prices recover and oil demand recover to some extent, but it's probably going to be middle to end of next year before oil demand, I think, is back to where it was pre-COVID. And some of those, the key drivers of oil demand growth before the pandemic were expected to be petrochemicals and aviation, and certainly aviation may take many years to get back to where it was before. I think it's probably, in my view, too early to say we've seen peak oil demand. I think we are already seeing in different places around the world oil demand start to rise, congestion levels in cities like Beijing close to where they were before the pandemic, in some cases even higher. And of course, mass transit is way down because people don't want to be in crowded spaces. But I think even if we see oil demand quickly recover, even if prices go up a bit further, I don't think they're going to go up too much further, and shale is part of the reason for that. Complacency would be the wrong takeaway from what we've seen in the shock of this year. Business as usual in terms of oil demand continuing to grow 1% to 2% year after year, on and on and on, is fundamentally inconsistent with coming anywhere close to achieving climate goals to which nations have committed. And so in order to believe that that future will be true, business as usual, you need to believe that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the world will be as complacent with the impacts of climate change as in many parts of the world. It seems to be today. And I think we're seeing that change in important ways. If you look at polling data, you see much stronger sense of urgency among younger demographic than older demographic. You see rising, not just Greta Thunberg on the cover of Time magazine as Person of the Year, but rising levels of activism and urgency. And just in the U.S. in the last 48 hours, we've seen the impacts of some of that activism in terms of how it can impact our domestic oil and gas sector with some key pipeline projects rejected as a result of that. So this is the trend in terms of where we're headed. We're also seeing the cost of dealing with this come down as new technologies emerge, the cost of renewables come down and other technologies, because we'll need much more than renewables in order to get to a low carbon future. The Middle East, I think, has a very strong potential role to play in that. We've seen some of the lowest cost for solar auctions in the UAE, for example. But as I said, we're going to need more than just solar and wind to think about decarbonizing not just the electricity system. Electricity is only 20% of final energy demand, but all the other parts of the energy sector, buildings and industry and aviation and shipping. And that's going to mean global industries for hydrogen, global industries for carbon capture and carbon removal. We will, I think, continue to see growth in petchem, and obviously not all of that fuel is burned. When you think about places in the world that have very low cost renewable energy, like many Gulf states or others in the Middle East, the potential to think about, it's hard to generate electricity and transport that over long distances, but you can think about something like green hydrogen and transport that over longer distances, and think about building new clean energy industries in which the Middle East can take a leadership role. I think the Middle East also needs to contribute, not just because there are commercial opportunities there and low cost clean energy opportunities, but also reducing emissions within its own borders. We know that a warming climate may render parts of the Middle East uninhabitable, and actually through 2040, BP, as one example, projects the annual growth rate of energy to be faster in the Middle East than it is even in China. So there's a leadership role to play in helping to use energy more efficiently and to reduce emissions within the Middle East. Also a leadership role to be played, I think, in thinking about, because it is going to take a long time as we transition to other fuels, and we'll be using oil and gas for quite a while, to think about how to use those in the lowest carbon footprint way possible. The barrel in the Middle Eastern country barrel today is a lower greenhouse gas footprint barrel than in many other parts of the world. When we think about methane and flaring and the energy intensity of that, taking a leadership role, including, for example, with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia chairing the G20 this year, in thinking about how to put items like that on the agenda through the lens of climate change, I think could help move in quite a positive direction. We're already seeing countries in the Middle East engaging and contributing to these solutions, and we're going to hear more about that from Robin and from Leila. We see industry leadership, companies like Saudi Aramco that are part of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, or ADNOC, which is engaging in important activities like a project with Emirates Steel that employs captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. But nonetheless, I think several countries across the Middle East face considerable challenges in terms of the exposure of their national economies to revenue impacts and to the energy transition as it proceeds. I'll say just a quick final comment on the potential impact in my own country of the election in November. Obviously, if we see Vice President Biden win, and the polls would suggest that today, but 4 or 5 months is a long time, you'll see an administration that places climate change very, very near to, if not at the top of its policy agenda. And that's going to mean a significant change in how it prioritizes this issue and how it looks for opportunities to partner with countries around the world to move that agenda forward. The Vice President Biden has indicated he intends to act on climate protection and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think he also has quite strong foreign policy experience and recognizes it is a global problem. US is 15% of global emissions. There will need to be an international approach and cooperation with countries in the Middle East, both on new technologies, but also on issues of transition and the economic reform within countries that are heavily dependent on petrodollars today. I think that will continue to be important, as well as the bilateral relationship that at least from the public comments, the vice president has made. The Middle East will be important to things like his commitment to try to find a way to proceed with re-entry of some sort into the Iran deal, other dynamics within the region that will be very important in the US foreign policy agenda. And I think the discussion about energy will be an important part of that on both the supply and the demand side. So we can come back to some of those things, but let me stop there, John, and turn it back to you and to Robin and Leila.
Jason, thank you very much for starting us off with those thoughts about both the Middle East and the possible developments in the US with implications for the Middle East. Robin, it's over to you now, please.
Thank you, John, and thanks, Jason, for that very helpful framing and you've reminded us of some of the key issues. So I've got a presentation here. If we can just, the team can put that up, that would be appreciated. Great, thank you. So what I would like to discuss, it's the paper that was recently published that I wrote for the Center on gas demand in the Middle East. And although it's about the future of gas demand in the Middle East, it touches on many of these issues that Jason has highlighted for us. Because of course, the future of gas demand in the Middle East is very much bound up with the efforts that are being made in energy efficiency, subsidy reform, the rise of alternative energy, and that's not just renewables, but also nuclear power and other forms of energy. And of course, the region's whole economic development and progress. Now, as Jason reminds us, the Middle East has been a very important area for energy demand growth in the past couple of decades and will be over the next few decades as well. And the timeline in the study here goes out to 2035, so the next decade and a half, and covers the Middle East plus Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean countries. So this is, over the past 2 decades, there's been, of course, a very rapid rise of energy demand in this region, both for oil and for gas and for the derivative electricity. And so gas production has had to rise very quickly to meet that demand, as you see on the left. And in fact, this region has been after Asia, has been the single largest area in gross terms for gas demand growth, more than North America, despite the shale boom there. And that's quite remarkable, I think, given that this region was already, even in 2000, was a very heavily gasified region. So it's, in gas terms, this region is exceptionally gas dependent. Now, over the next decade and a half, I think that picture's, sorry, if we could just go back to the original slide. Thank you. Over the next decade and a half, this is going to change, I think, to an extent. And there's a number of factors there. So we have improved efficiency of use. We have subsidy reform, which means that gas prices are rising generally, and also electricity and prices of other derivatives. We have slower economic growth, and we have the rise of alternative generation. And if you look at the chart on the top right, showing how the economy looks like, so in the early 2000s, we had economic growth across the region of in some years up to 8%. That has fallen over time. Obviously, this year will be a very tough year. Probably 2021 will be very tough as well, with substantial negative growth. And then rates might bounce back to about 3.5% or so, which is respectable in world terms, but not the very fast rates that we've got used to previously. So next slide, please. So this just outlines the area of the study. And you can see this is it's interesting, the Middle East is so gasified in terms of the proportion of gas use in each economy. Even in a country like Jordan, which has very little gas resource of its own, gas is still a major part of the energy mix. And yet there's very little connectivity. So there are a couple of countries joined by pipelines within the Gulf. Iran is exporting to Iraq. Egypt exports gas to neighbors, but other than that, there's very little interconnectivity. Nothing like the amount of connectivity that you have in North America or in Europe. And this, I think, will be an important factor, which I'll touch on the implications of that over the next few years. So next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the key factors we see at the moment, as Jason says, is deployment of renewables in the Middle East. Now, they remain so far a very small part of the energy mix. Most of the electricity demand is coming from gas and to an extent, particularly in some countries, from oil. But we're really on the cusp of a major transformation in that, because renewables, and particularly solar power, but other renewables as well, have become so competitive. You know, when we're seeing bids in Abu Dhabi at 1.35 cents per kilowatt hour, Saudi Arabia has just said they're going to beat that in their latest tender for solar power. Really, the cheapest electricity you could find anywhere in the world. And that means that solar is extremely competitive and is going to take market share. And we're seeing solar coming up, of course, in the UAE, Jordan, Egypt. Those are three of the early leaders. But we're seeing now projects in Saudi Arabia on a large scale, Oman, and no doubt it will see it in other countries too. And so in the view of this study, this will particularly squeeze out oil from the power mix over the next decade and a half, but will also be slowing the rate of growth in gas. But it's not just solar, because we're also seeing growth in nuclear power, which is primarily in the UAE, which should be starting up this year, and also even in coal, which maybe seems surprising, but Dubai has a major coal plant which will be starting operations quite soon. And this means that if gas demand in the power sector is slowing down, then overall gas demand in the region will tend to slow as well. And I've shown here a comparison of gas demand by scenario. So I've looked at BP, I've looked at IEA, I've looked at ExxonMobil, Gas Exporting Countries Forum, so a number of major forecasts. So if we could just go back 2 slides there, please. Thank you. So in the top right here, and you can see the forecast this study comes with is considerably lower in future gas demand than most of the other international bodies are coming up with. Only the IEA Sustainable Development, which is a very kind of, say, green heavy scenario, comes in lower. So next slide. And what we're really seeing is a shift in the weight of gas demand from power to industry. So gas demand in the region will keep growing, but more and more of that will have to be from going into industry rather than the power sector. And this is a bit of a challenge, because if gas prices in the region are rising, how does industry remain competitive against North America or China, other big areas of industrial gas demand? And this, I think, means a shift in the way gas is being used in industry. So we get away from bulk industries like aluminium, petrochemicals, let's say basic petrochemicals, steel, cement, and so on, and towards higher value, more sophisticated products. But of course, that means a lot more technology, expertise, and a lot more investment, but probably in overall in smaller facilities, smaller plants. So next slide, please. And there's a lot of different factors driving the findings of this study on gas demand. So there are some factors actually tending to increase gas demand in the region, particularly the oil phase out in power and industry. That's very big. That's occupying more than 100 billion cubic meters a year by the 2030s, extra gas demand. Climate change too, the region's heating up, more power needed for air conditioning. That also has a not insignificant effect. But then there's a lot of factors outweighing that, tending to decrease gas demand. So the subsidy reform in industry and power, the improvement in power generation efficiency. Power generation efficiency in the region is low at the moment. Average is not much over 30%, whereas there are countries in the region like Oman that achieve 40%, and we know that modern CCGTs, combined cycle gas turbines, can do 50% or better. Then there is the other forms of generation. So I mentioned coal, nuclear, but particularly and more in the longer term, renewables, which could be taking something like 150 BCM of gas demand away by 2035. And this obviously has major implications for the future of gas demand in the region and the gas industry. So there's a lot of new gas production coming. We know the Eastern Med is developing a lot of new gas. UAE has substantial sour gas, unconventional gas plans, a lot of extra gas production coming in Saudi Arabia. Iraq is capturing a lot of flared gas. So I've put that all together. There's a lot of extra gas coming. So what's it going to be used for? Well, can be for industry, as I've said, probably likely lighter industry on the whole. Can be exports, whether that's gas in by pipeline or LNG or electricity. But that's a bit challenging, because if gas is relatively higher cost than in the past, will it be competitive enough to to be suitable for export for LNG or pipeline gas. And I think there'll be more stress on intra-regional exports. So that picture of connectivity I showed earlier, there'll have to be more regional connectivity and gas going from gas-rich countries to less gas-rich neighbours. Enhanced oil recovery is an opportunity. And then also, as Jason alluded to, hydrogen, whether that's hydrogen for local use and industry, or whether it's hydrogen to be exported. So it's still a little bit more speculative how far that will develop, but that is another opportunity for the gas industry in the region. So it's a pretty quick tour through the study, but I'm sure we'll be able to get into some of these themes in the discussion.
Robin, thank you very much, and thank you, I know, for compressing a very large and thoughtful study into that short bit. Leila Benally, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I think I'll be actually quite brief. There are many, I think, lessons that we can draw from 2020, and I won't delve into the details of that. But I think there are three key lessons that are relevant for today's discussion. Lesson number one, I think we discovered a world that is much more interdependent, with the concentration of that dependence in very specific regions or countries. So for low-cost manufacturing, including for clean technologies, China will not be easy to replace. Its manufacturing capability or capacity is equivalent to that of the next 13 emerging markets. We also discovered, even if we were aware of them, but we really in 2020 discovered restrictions to projects, to supply chains in the LNG business, in shipping business, because they depend on Asian shipyards. Oil and gas field services also suffered because they equally depend on specialized engineering in Lombardy, Italy. And these are regions that were all heavily affected by the very first waves of COVID-19. So there will be some pressure in specific parts of the value chain, of the energy value chain, including at the low or decarbonized part ones, to decentralize and to localize. Lesson number two, and that's my little note to my fellow macroeconomists. I think we ended up agreeing that this is a very different crisis at last, finally, and that this pandemic should be modeled totally differently, because you will have long-term unemployment in the affected sectors. You will have bankruptcies. You will have the restructuring of several sectors all at the same time. And I think there's now an emerging consensus that the lost output cannot be recovered before 2023 at best. And we are gradually including the second round and third round effects of this crisis. And the negative demand shock that Jason referred to is, I think, quite important in that regard. So, and more importantly for the rest of my remarks, I think we will see indeed reduced and delayed investments, including in the energy space and including in the low carbon part of the energy space. So that is definitely reshaping, I think, the energy sector of the future in its different parts, conventional and non-conventional. And I think the lesson number three, and that's possibly Jason's favorite snapshot or favorite lesson, is that there is now a clear awareness, I hope so, that the most extreme demand response that we could get we locked down half of the world's population during several weeks. We drastically reduced the consumption of transportation fuels and industrial fuels, and that's still not enough to reach the Paris Agreement targets. So over the first few months of 2020, I think there are now numbers showing that the global daily CO2 emissions decreased 18% year on year. That's, even if this is an unprecedented decrease and historic decrease, it is still not enough. So what does the future hold across MENA, this important region, as we started by saying, for low carbon technologies and policies? I think the future is mixed, but I'd rather be bullish because I think for the region, for the first time, the regulations and the financing fundamentals are gradually being put in place. And by financing fundamentals, I mean the existence of those low-cost, low-carbon players with strong balance sheets and a relatively low leverage position, at least until the end of 2019. And if you add to it an increasingly consolidated institutional investor space and banking space particularly in this region, you start to have in the regional low carbon technology sector an interesting ecosystem for the first time, and with some of the characteristics that financiers are looking for in terms of market cap, in terms of dividends and liquidity. So in terms of the pipeline of investments, I hope most of you read Apicorp's latest regional investments outlook. I think it identified some of the similar trends that the IEA's Global Investments Outlook have looked at, but interestingly, except in the low carbon technologies and in the gas value chain. So we estimate at Apicorp that during the next 5 years, energy investments in MENA will total $792 billion. That's a decrease, 18% lower, 18% lower than last year's outlook. So like in the rest of the world, we will see capex cuts starting this year, not with a lag like in the most recent downturns. We don't see the lag of at least 1 year. This time we are cutting the investments in capex this year. And contrary to previous downturns, energy investments might not be able to pick up again until after 3 years at the best. So that's at the aggregate level. But when we deep dive, there are some positive features at the sector level, particularly in the low carbon and decarbonized part of the value chain. So the gas value chain, and this is, I think, the good news, registered the highest increase in planned investments compared to our outlook of last year. The increase was $28 billion. That's 13% increase. So, and the reasons for that are, I would say, very simple, and building up on some of the points that Robin was saying. We think that in addition to the need to cover domestic demand, which, and I agree, that's now increasingly more driven by the industrial sector than by utilities, there are also strategic drivers behind these investments, whether they are related to development of unconventional gas reserves, we have the example of Jafurah in Saudi Arabia, or the increase of low-cost LNG capacity, example is Qatar coming, to capture more market share in an increasingly oversupplied LNG market. In power, even if we noticed in countries with already fragile utilities, without citing names, degradation of revenue collection, new working capital lines at high cost, etc. Even if you noticed a decrease in capital investments because a lot of the projects were sanctioned last year, I think the renewable program overall, especially in the Gulf, but also in other pockets like Morocco, etc., were not affected. So in fact, I think the good news in the power sector is that the sector reform might accelerate post-COVID-19 with more distributed generation, including solar PV, more energy storage, including with batteries, but with others as well, and net and smart metering, because that will be increasingly needed. However, the issue is that the ecosystem I mentioned earlier is not there yet for additional required technologies, and both Jason and Robin started hitting at those, and I particularly would like to mention energy storage with its all components, especially when it's linked with the deployment of intermittent renewables. CCUS, carbon capture and utilization and storage, I think that's quite key, we're still not there yet in putting in place all the elements for that, and hydrogen. So I think post-COVID-19, there is a sort of emerging consensus at least in the energy sector, not outside, that you will need most existing fuels and technologies that are here, except with a few exceptions. But the required investments really need to be taken, including in research development and including in supporting technologies at every phase of development. And the key concern that I'm raising here is at this time, and it was also highlighted in our investment outlook, the traditional, I would say, vicious circle of low revenue, low investments, low output needs to be broken. And we are hoping that this time we will have a virtuous cycle of investments in lower costs, lower carbon, sustainable assets that needs to be induced. And to finish on a positive note, I think that one area I would push the reasoning a little bit further than my colleagues Jason and Robin. I think one area where in this region where that virtuous cycle of investments can develop is actually related to hydrogen. green hydrogen. I would extend it a bit more than just green hydrogen. I would put in it all embedded green electrons, including when you produce ammonia out of and other embedded green electrons and low carbon electrons, because I don't want to left gas aside. I don't want to leave gas aside. So in countries that can really oversize, because then there will be a market share battle that will happen. So in those countries like Saudi Arabia, potentially Morocco, that can oversize their low carbon or decarbonized energy system competitively, I think you might see the emergence of those embedded green electrons dollars, hopefully that will replace the direct or indirect dependency on petrol and gas dollars that this region is being known for traditionally. Thank you very much.
Leila, thank you so much for those remarks and for the clarity and the crispness of those remarks. As I now shift to our discussion, I'm going to kind of combine some questions that came to me as I was hearing each of the speakers make their remarks, and then also build into that some of the questions that are already appearing in the Q&A feature. So one question that comes to mind in this time of considerable volatility, and I note your expectation, Leila, that one could be waiting until 2023 to see full recovery from the effects of coronavirus. But in this time of great volatility, I'm struck at the strength of your note of optimism there. Yesterday, we saw this very, very big splash announcement that came from the NEOM project in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with Aqua Power and Air Products to develop a $5 billion hydrogen plant. I guess my question, against the backdrop of all of that volatility, is what prevails in your opinion? Is it the volatility? Is it the impulse to do what is familiar, namely conventional fuels? Or is it a time for when new big departures could be seen more than in a one-off fashion?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's an excellent question. I definitely agree with the fact that we will be living in a world of increasing volatility, including oil prices. Even if we are in an environment where hopefully OPEC Plus might be able to manage that within a relatively viable band for everyone. But we will, because of the nature of the market we're living in today, there will be bursts of volatility to the downside or to the upside as well. And that's also relevant, and you saw that in stock markets, in countries' policies, etc. So I think we will have to live with that world of volatility as we go. But the reason why I'm potentially a little bit bullish, because I mean, I look at the bearish factors and bullish factors, and in this situation, I think there is room to be a bit more bullish than usual, especially during this period, for I think a very simple reason. If we all agree on a hypothesis that oil as a commodity that is, which pricing basically defines the competitiveness of other fuels in transportation, in utilities, and now increasingly in industries as well. And if we agree with the hypothesis that oil actually might transform itself into becoming a normal commodity, because I hope that we are reaching a stage where cost curves start to mean something again, and basically low-cost producers would dominate in terms of market shares, and then you will have the higher cost producers filling the tail end. So I think this has been coming for some time, and it has been long awaited, especially by the low-cost producers. But COVID-19, in a way, have potentially accelerated that, especially if we believe, like Jason, in some tension on the future demand side. So I think that's sort of bullish factors for low carbon or decarbonized energy system that can be oversized. I think it's coming from the fact that even in that low interest rate environment that we are living in, with the decreasing cost of capital that not only renewables, but I'm hoping that other technologies might follow in terms of being able to be financed competitively. I think decarbonized energy systems, especially if they are at scale, I don't want to use oversized too much, but at scale at least, to be able to be competitive in the future, they will really have no other options than to position themselves in the lowest part of that cost curve to be sustainable. Again, if we have a post-COVID-19 world with tensions on demand, and if we add to it carbon pricing, I mean, any form of carbon pricing, I think that will lead the way to this sort of decarbonized energy system, and where this region can play a big role because of its low cost position already on the financial side, and of course the availability of sun and wind.
So picking up on the question that was posed by Khalid Kamal in the Q&A section, do I take it correctly, Leila, that you view this new hydrogen project as an example of one of the big investments at scale that one could see more of? I don't want to put words into your mouth, but
no, because I don't comment on specific projects unless they are in my database, in a bigger database. I think overall, there will be some projects that will prevail and others that will not. I think if you have some of the fundamentals that I mentioned earlier in my remarks in terms of financial investments, I think that would be quite important for those projects. There will have to be projects that are economically viable. But I'll not comment on specific projects in a specific country. I'm sorry.
This is the wisdom of somebody with experience. Robin, let me go to you. You commented a couple of times in your remarks about the importance of connectivity in the gas space within the Middle East. There's a question from Shada Al-Sharif, who points out that for countries like Jordan, switching to clean energy is also a matter of energy security, aside from the positive contribution to Jordan's NDC and the climate objectives. So this question says, is this a sufficient driver for adopting a low carbon development pathway? Maybe I could broaden that a little bit to say, how do you see the interplay between the benefits that can come from greater connectivity, be it gas, power, across borders, and the energy security and national objectives that individual countries will pursue?
Yes, well, I mean, Jordan is a country that's obviously suffered very badly in the past few years from lack of energy security, from over-dependence on certain routes that turned out not to be secure, and interruptions to its gas supplies in particular. And that has been very much an impetus for Jordan to develop its renewable sector very successfully, but also to diversify its gas imports and to look at other forms of energy like oil shale as well. So the diversification, it's some of it is towards lower carbon energy, but not all of it. And it's not inevitable that happens, as other countries in the region that are looking at increasing their use of coal instead of gas for energy security reasons, and obviously not for climate or environmental reasons. So it's not totally clear cut. I think on the energy security debate, there's always a balance or a tension between self-sufficiency versus the benefits that come from interconnectivity and mutual trade and interdependence. And I think, there isn't a lot of security or international security that comes from every country trying to be North Korea and completely self-sufficient. But there's also problems for countries being very dependent on a single source or on a single neighbor for all of their energy. And that doesn't just apply to the Middle East, but that's a rule in many parts of the world. No, I think overall there are major economic gains to be had in the Middle East from gas connectivity. There are some very gas-rich countries in the region. There are some others that are not so gas-rich, and also from electricity interconnectivity. There is a certain amount of electricity interconnections, more being proposed, not enough though at the moment. And I think as the amount of renewables in the system grows, of course, the benefits of electricity interconnectivity will become greater and greater to balance out periods of lower renewable output, seasonal changes, daily, hourly variations. Those kind of interconnections will become more and more important. and in general mutual trade in the Middle East, and fostering that kind of energy trade, I think, is actually a positive outlook for, or it's a positive factor driving increased regional security. So, as I say, yes, yeah, I acknowledge there is a tension there, but I think overall, getting away from the kind of single or bilateral model towards a more multilateral energy trading system across the region would be a positive development.
Very good. Jason, let me turn to you if I might, and I very much hope that the other speakers will jump in and contribute as well, argue amongst yourselves, etc., just to make it a little spicy for the audience. I'd like to, Jason, turn to more the geopolitics elements that are present in decision making around energy. So 2 questions here, if I could. One links back to the United States. Do you think that there are implications for in the geopolitics unfolding in the Middle East of a Trump versus Biden outcome in the US election in November? Would that have any implications for the kind of relationships that one has seen developing in relation to conventional fuels in recent years, the OPEC Plus grouping, for example? Do you think that would play itself out in any meaningful way?
Yeah, sure. Let me quickly comment on 1 or 2 things that were just said a second ago as well, because I think Leila made an important point. When she noted that we saw I mentioned how we saw this staggering 25% drop in oil demand and what that harbinger of what might come. But she also put it in the correct context, which is the other way to view that is we told more than 4 billion people to stay in place, and oil demand only fell 25%. So when we have these conversations about, political instability, risk to oil producers, petrostates will go bankrupt because there won't be any revenue, we're sort of assuming a world that doesn't use any oil. And I sort of tried to highlight this tension between, on the one, 2 things are both true. It is true that if we continue to use oil at anywhere close to the rates we are now, we're not coming anywhere close to our climate goals, and we're going to suffer the impacts of climate change, which unfortunately look like they may be worse, not better, than scientists have been modeling and projecting, including our colleagues at Columbia. But the other is, it is really hard to think about a scenario that sees a dramatic shift away from oil as a fuel. I think one consequence of that, she sort of talked about the impact of, maybe markets start to work and being a low-cost producer means something. If we do start to see a scenario where demand were to gradually decline, we're not going to get off of oil anytime soon. Think about the reaction that the investment community would have, that the public would have. We're sort of peak oil demand is here. It's easy to see investment in new supply drying up, even though we have pretty steep decline rates. And you will continue to see a need for production from low-cost producers. You would assume with lower demand, that would mean lower prices for them, but that's not obvious to me either. You actually could see periods of underinvestment and increased volatility and price spikes, because the period of transition, not an end state where we meet our climate goals or we're not using oil anymore, the multi-decade period of transition is going to be very messy and uncertain in terms of investment in the sector. On your question about geopolitics, again, we're going to see, I think, a different changes in U.S. foreign policy. I mentioned the Iran deal. That's one of those. The vice president in his public comments has had rather strong language when it comes to some countries in the region, particularly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so I think issues around conflicts in the region, the war in Yemen, other things about these bilateral relationships may look different moving forward. And I think that in that bilateral relationship and in those diplomatic relationships, the issue of how one thinks about management of oil markets and how one thinks about the importance of investment and leadership in issues of climate, the extent to which countries are prioritizing climate and playing a constructive role in the Paris UNFCCC process, those are going to become more important for U.S. foreign policy, I think, if we see a change in administrations.
So if I may, let me jump in with a follow-up question to you, Jason, staying within the geopolitical sphere. When we talk about the Middle East, I mean, we tend to focus on the GCC and on Iran, but Israel, as you know, a gas producer, and with, of course, tensions around ownership, if you will, of the gas fields. How do you see that playing out in the context of elections and hopefully a fresh White House transition? And I also see a question from Philip Cornell. Hi, Phil. Regarding China, and you know, we haven't really talked about China and how things have developed between China and the United States, and the increasing tensions, and what impact that might have on oil and gas and the economy in general in this part of the world.
Yeah, no, those are good questions. I could say a word on China. I don't know if Robin wants to comment on what he thinks the outlook is for Eastern Mediterranean gas, which I don't know that it would be too different depending on what the election outlook is in November. I think there are other issues geopolitically in terms of potential tensions and Israel's the dynamic between Israel and other countries in the region. Some of the recent not fully explained concerning events in Iran, for example. But Robin, do you want to say anything about Eastern Med gas, and I'll comment on China?
Yeah, look, I think the geopolitical side of Eastern Med gas it's very important for the countries concerned. It's not so important on the grand global scale, but it is certainly very important for Israel, for Egypt, Jordan, Cyprus, and Turkey. And that's become a more complex and a more problematic story just as time goes on. And it's certainly a big hindrance to the development of the East Med gas beyond what's already being done. But I think really East Med gas is also very much at the moment a prisoner of economics. It's deep water gas. The fields are quite large in some cases, not enormously large. And the challenge has always been how to find markets. The local markets are fairly small and basically have all the gas that they need now. And getting to other markets, particularly to the European market or to the global LNG market, is really, really tough with quite high cost gas supplies and then long underwater pipelines or trying to find a place for an LNG terminal somewhere in the region. And I think really that's at the moment is what's holding back the East Med gas more than just the geopolitics. But you know, put the two things together, it certainly makes it difficult to go much beyond where we currently are with East Med, where gas is at the moment making quite an important contribution to regional gas security and meeting demand in the Eastern Mediterranean.
I would just quickly say, so John can move on China. I mean, there's not a lot that Republicans and Democrats seem to be able to agree on in Washington, but one of them is that the United States needs to be taking a pretty tough line toward China these days. And I think that will continue, although probably in quite a different way. On climate, a key question will be whether the U.S.-China bilateral relationship can be segmented from what was going to continue to be a rather tense and difficult bilateral relationship. And I think that's an open question. On energy, we've seen the phase one trade deal approach of sort of making China promise to buy stuff. And I think that obviously, particularly given the COVID economic collapses, revealed why that was not a sensible approach. And China, even if it tries, is going to come nowhere close to meeting those goals. But I think from China's standpoint, what has happened in the last couple of years in the US, is probably raising concerns about being overly dependent on US energy exports because of political uncertainty. So I think there has already been a shift toward closer engagement, cooperation, and energy trade relations between Gulf energy producers and China. And I think that probably is going to continue regardless of what happens in November.
Okay, I'm going to pose two questions, and Leila, I'll come to you first and you can jump in with your comment there. But there are two, I think, quite interesting questions that we haven't touched on yet that I think are worth getting to. So one, Kyrillos Risk, I apologize if I am butchering the proper pronunciation of your name, poses the question in the Q&A about the role of water scarcity in driving renewable energy development across the region. And I'd be interested in any of your thoughts from any of the speakers that wish to touch on that one. A second one, which I think is hanging in the background of much of what we have just been talking about, comes from Jonathan Walters, who says, given the very low cost of renewable energy projects that are being developed across the Middle East, will those opportunities, the clean energy source, not be more meaningful to the future of the Middle East than the kind of ebbs and flows of oil and gas markets? So Leila, let me turn to you first. Please pick up whatever the thread was that you wanted to pull on a moment ago, and then please, as you wish, address either or both of those two questions that I've just posed.
Thanks, Jonathan. Since you want us to disagree, just to spice things up, I'm going to gently disagree with Robin. And actually, sorry?
Why be gentle about it? No, I'm
because I actually agree with him when on the fact that interconnectivity in the Middle East is a positive for the future of the region. But actually, what I disagree with him is the mild way he's been putting that, because I think from my perspective, I've been watching how this region's interconnectivity has decreased over time. You have a number of idle and empty pipeline and infrastructure that is not being used in the region, that has been either bombarded or not being used for commercial or legal reasons between either Iran, the UAE, the GCC, Iraq, and in North Africa as well. So I think when it comes to gas infrastructure, I think we need more than to say that it will be just a small positive. It's actually, if this region can emulate the model of the European Union, and may I remind you, the integration of the European Union, including in its gas and electricity interconnection, came from the original coal and steel gathering. I think it will create another level of competitiveness between the different countries. And I've been looking at that in the different countries that I worked in this region, and that it totally changes the competitiveness of the different fuels and different technologies. Now, to push it a bit further, it's true that electricity interconnectivity here has been easier to apply than gas connections. And we've seen the integration of electricity happening in North Africa, and then East Med, and then between the GCC. But I think if we are, again, coming back to that issue around low-cost renewables that we can oversize and build at scale, I think there are definitely there's definitely a huge potential there that is being untapped from a transmission and midstream perspective. And may I remind you, I mean, now I'm probably pushing it a bit too far, but with the latest ADNOC gas pipeline deal, midstream deal, midstream assets are being viewed as assets that you can monetize, that you can lease and monetize over the future. To answer very briefly the question, maybe the first question about the role of water scarcity in driving renewable energy development, I think that's quite key, particularly that now reverse osmosis in desalination has become the norm when it comes to water desalination, and costs of reverse osmosis has declined to less than, I think, 3 cents per cubic meter of water. So if that you can couple to it, you don't need the massive, you don't need to combine that with the massive CCGTs or even nuclear power to be able to make it work with some scalable renewable system. You can actually today desalinate water with the right cost. But now the issue is that you need a coast to do that, and you need the right type of conditions to be able to do that.
Great, thank you. I heard your quote-unquote disagreement with Robin as really amounting to vigorous agreement, but maybe Robin has a different view. Robin, would you like to come in on water scarcity issue, or this question from Jonathan Walters about, why are we talking so much about the oil and gas future when the low-cost renewables are really going to drive the story, if I might paraphrase in that fashion?
Yeah, well, I'd like to address Jonathan's question. I think okay, so firstly, the low-cost renewables in terms of meeting the region's own energy demand are absolutely competitive and will just get more and more so. I mean, there's issues with balancing and storage, energy storage and so on. Those issues, I think, are a lot less in this region than they would be in a lot of North America or Northern Europe. And so I think there's no question that the decarbonisation of the region's own energy demand and assuring a secure and very low cost supply of electricity that'll be a major theme over the next 10, 20 years. I think what's more the question is though, then what happens to the region's role as an exporter of oil and gas? And it's got to be said that, renewables do not generate the rents that gas and particularly oil generate. The region's got a fantastic solar resource, and some countries have been very successful at launching projects and getting costs down to very low levels. But there are a lot of sunny countries in the world that have a lot of deserts and unused land. Sure, the solar power in this region may be cheaper than that comes out of Australia or out of the southwestern US, let's say, or that can be installed in Spain or Italy, but it's not that much cheaper. So we're not going to transition this region from a major exporter of oil and gas, where that's the driver of the economy and generates very, very high rents, to it being an exporter of solar power or of solar or renewable derived products, whether that's hydrogen or chemicals, steel, materials like this, which are also generating very high rents. So the region can be an exporter of these kind of low carbon materials. But in order to make that a foundation of the economy, there has to be a lot more sophisticated value added stuff on top of that, not just simply having the fortunate access to very large oil and gas reserves that are produced at very low cost. And that's really going to be the challenge for the region, I think. And also these new markets, whether if it's a market for, let's say, large scale hydrogen exports or long distance electricity exports, or the export of decarbonized products like ammonia or steel to Europe or Japan, countries like that. These markets are not just going to appear, they have to be created. Same as the LNG market had to be created in the 60s and 70s. And that means large scale investments. It means a lot of work on the value chain and on markets and on business models and a lot of work on technology development. And the region it's not going to be the only region doing this. We know Japan and Germany have got ambitious hydrogen strategies, but the region is going to have to play its part. It can't just passively think that a global hydrogen market will appear and that it will necessarily be a part of it. So that's really, I think, something that the region's got to pay a lot of attention to, is how do you actually create these low carbon businesses and be a major player in them from the start.
Thank you, Robin. Jason, we may turn to you then for kind of last reaction on some of the comments that you've heard or the questions posed around the importance of water scarcity or the push and pull. Why are we spending so much time thinking about oil and gas when the falling costs of renewables are such an important part of the story? To you, and then I think we'll be pretty close to quitting time.
Thanks. Well, I mean, just on that last point, I think the rents that Robin talked about are one thing. The other reason we're still talking about oil is because renewables, solar and wind, create electricity, and oil is mostly used for lots of other stuff. A little bit of oil used to create electricity, but not very much. And so we can electrify some of the things that oil is used for, but a lot are difficult and more costly to electrify. So that's the backdrop in which we're thinking about the pace of transition. There's just much less competitiveness within where oil is used than there is within how we generate electricity. I think the only thing that I would say by way of conclusion is sort of the broad discussion here, which has been incredibly interesting and important, about the outlook for a region that for many countries is heavily dependent on revenue from production of oil and gas, but also enormous opportunities to lead in new emerging clean energy technologies. Is a little bit coming back to what Safwan asked about the context of the changing role of that region in the world and the US relationship with that region in the world. And so we have gone from producing 5 to pre-COVID 13 million barrels a day of oil, and we were on the cusp again before COVID of becoming a net exporter of oil, although now we're still going to be an importer for a while on a net basis. And that raised many concerns that the sort of Carter doctrine that the US would defend with military force if necessary, its interest in the region, was something that countries in the region could no longer rely upon. And I think that recent events, Abqaiq and many others, have given countries more, not less, reason to believe that that is true. And so I think at the same time, it is going to be more important, not less, that we have dialogue and cooperation and coordination. And even recently with this oil market collapse, I mean, part of the way that that got addressed was US dialogue with OPEC and OPEC plus countries, and then this extraordinary meeting of the G20 that the IEA was involved in. I would like to see that not just be a one-off thing, but that there be continued way to think about a broader set of producers and what would traditionally have been thought of as producers and consumers, countries within the IEA, OPEC, G20, finding opportunities to have dialogue and come together about how we think about not only stability within the traditional energy markets, which, as we said a minute ago, may become more volatile, but also how we cooperate and work together to build the cleaner energy system that we need in the future. I think that's going to be more important moving forward, and I think that should continue to be an area of focus for both countries in the Middle East and the US and others.
Okay, so thanks very much. With an eye on the clock, I'll start bringing us to a conclusion. I do so with apologies. We have answered many fewer of the questions that were in the Q&A dialogue than the number that we have failed to answer, and that's inevitable to a certain extent, but nonetheless that doesn't feel great. Let me, in concluding, make a couple of programming remarks. First, as I said at the outset, a full video recording of today's program will be available both through the Columbia Global Center in Amman and its website, and through the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy in the coming days. Second, let me highlight that today's program is just one example of the events and scholarship coming from our two centers and from Columbia University as a whole. For more information on the Amman Center's upcoming programs, please visit the events section of their website, which can be found at Global Centers, that is one word and spelled the American way, sorry to those who know the Queen's English, globalcenters.columbia.edu/Amman. And in regard to the Energy Center, let me draw your attention to a couple of things. First, our podcast series, which is called Columbia Energy Exchange, questions that we didn't address directly today came from a doctoral student in China who was kind enough to thank us for that podcast, and that reminds me to talk about it. Just to give you a taste of some of the coverage of that podcast series, recent editions have involved conversations with people such as these, US Congresswoman Kathy Castor, who is the chair of the House of Representatives Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, Mr. Makhtar Diop from the World Bank, His Excellency Dharmendra Pradhan, India's Minister of Petroleum, Natural Gas and Steel, Gina McCarthy from the Natural Resources Defense Council, Omar Suena Al-Suwaidi from Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So for more information about the podcast series, please look at our website, energypolicy.columbia.edu. Last thing, a specific programming point, we will have a webinar open to the public on July 29th at 12 noon East Coast time in the US. That program is focusing on the US power sector after carbon. It will feature Dr. Peter Foxpenner of Boston University, who will be hosted by our colleague, Dr. Melissa Lott, who's the head of our center's power sector program. Melissa will be joined by three outstanding CGEP colleagues, those being Cheryl LaFleur, the former chairperson of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and now a distinguished visiting fellow, David Hill, who is the former general counsel of the US Department of Energy and the utility called NRG. And last but not least, Richard Kaufman, who is the former energy czar of the state of New York. With that, I will pass the floor back to our host, Dr. Safwan Masri, with thanks to him and to his colleagues for the excellent collaboration. I hope only that the next time we do this, we can do it face-to-face and in person and in Amman. Safwan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. I do hope that we do this again in person in Amman. We'd love to host everybody. It is a wonderful partnership, and it really makes me very, very proud to be able to work with the Center on Global Energy Policy. More than 3 decades at Columbia University, and I have to say that to see the kind of scholarship and knowledge and information that comes out of the center is really a source of tremendous pride. I think it is the center of gravity for much of the important discourse around energy around the world. So thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jason, for your contributions and for your leadership. Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Leila. I do hope that we can all see one another, and I again very soon. And I again thank all of our participants for tuning in and for benefiting from this really richly textured discussion. I have learned a lot, and I can only imagine that everybody who tuned in had a lot to learn and to gain. So thank you for all of that.